And I remember one of my senior colleagues calling me over and saying, just pointing at his computer screen, which had, the article about the mod on it. He said, "Is this you?" And I said, "Yeah." One senior member of the profession said to me, once he found out that I'd been modding in my spare time, that every waking hour of your life should be spent dedicated to your legal career. And that was his way of saying, drop this game dev nonsense. It's not going to lead anywhere.
Salve friend, and welcome to one of the most unique game development stories in recent memory. My name is Jake Decker, and I used to work with some of the NoClip crew back at my previous job at GameSpot. It was there that I made several documentaries on various mods and role-playing games. So when The Forgotten City blew up earlier this year, Danny reached out to see if I could help them tell this story, and I happily obliged. The Forgotten City is a game with almost no combat in which you interview NPCs and attempt to solve a mystery before a calamity kills them all. It originally started out as a mod for the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, a mod created by one person with almost no game development experience. But that's not the end of the story. Nick Pierce not only spent years of his life reimagining his mod as a standalone game, but in doing so he risked his entire life savings and jeopardized a high-powered career which if he quit, he'd never be able to return to. In this documentary, we're going to explore how he made this game and the personal development story that lasted almost a decade. Also, for those worried about spoilers, fear not. We will not be spoiling puzzle solutions or the story beats of the mod or commercial game. That said, if you want an entirely clean playthrough, we recommend playing a little bit of The Forgotten City before you watch this. The story of The Forgotten City began nearly 10 years ago when Nick Pierce, a well-established lawyer based in Australia, started modding the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim in his free time. With almost no prior experience, Nick had to teach himself nearly every aspect of development, from coding to design, all while working in one of the most demanding fields there is.
I was writing a novel at the time, and while it was great, I wasn't as passionate about it as I was about video games. And so I thought, how can I write a video game? And it's this catch-22 where you can't write a video game until you've written a video game. And so the only way to break that catch-22 was to just make a mod. So I started teaching myself how to make mods. But yeah, I had to learn, the very basics. So level design and lighting and nav meshing and scripting, and learning this proprietary scripting language of how to make things happen in the game. The first thing I did was I just made this big underground city in a state of ruin. And while it was pretty cool, it just felt like a big empty world. And so then I thought, what would it be like if you could travel back in time within this city? And so that gave me the idea of introducing this time travel mechanic. So I allowed the player to go back in time and meet the inhabitants of the city before it was ruined, and entrusted them with figuring out who or what was going to destroy it. And in the first draft of that mod, it was a really bleak fixed ending where the player was saddled with an enormous amount of guilt because their interference in the timeline was ultimately what caused the city to be destroyed, and that wasn't. It wasn't a great ending. And so it occurred to me that what I could do to make the story a whole lot better was to give the player the opportunity to go back to the beginning of that day all over again and try to use what they'd learned and gathered to make things right. And so the logical step was to essentially just invent a time loop. So I just said, all right, well, let's make it so that when all hell breaks loose, you can escape back to the portal from which you emerged, travel back to the beginning of the day, and start again. And I ended up having to figure out time travel, but not just time travel, dynamic time travel where you could go back and forward in time, because no one had done that before in that engine. So I just had to kind of bash my head against the wall until I figured it out. And that was a huge challenge for getting the story to it, because, you know, you start in present day in the city, travel back in time, and then when everything goes to hell, you've got a chance to escape back to the time portal from which you originated, and you go back to the beginning of the day, sort of Groundhog Day style. And so I had to have the ability to just reset time quickly on command, and so it evolved quite organically in that way. And at the time, I hadn't actually heard of any other time loop games. I'd never played Majora's Mask. I later found out that came out in 2000. But yeah, at the time, I was just thinking about how to make sure the player had as much agency as possible, and how to make sure that they had freedom and felt a sense of ownership over the outcome of the game. And so that also necessitated that there be multiple endings, because, you know, if you're caught in a time loop, there's all sorts of ways it can end. And so the endings, all the different endings, again, they came about organically, because if you are in a time loop, then, you know, logically doing certain things like killing the person who creates the time loop, that's going to have a consequence.
You.
When the mod took off, it took me a really, really long time to decide that I was going to make it into a standalone game. So at the time I was working as a lawyer. I had a pretty well-established career. I'd been working for 10 years, but I discovered this really burning passion for modding and by extension game dev. So I made this mod. At the time, it was just a passion project. You know, I spent 1,700 hours on it, but it was my first project, and I really didn't expect it to be a big thing. I thought, you know, maybe if a few thousand people play it, then, you know, the 1,700 hours that I spend on it divided by those few thousand people, that would mean that, you know, there was a good ratio of like my time to their enjoyment, and then that would be fine. But yeah, I didn't expect it to be downloaded by 3.7 million people, which is where it's up to at the moment, and that's crazy. Like at a certain point, you can't even conceptualize how many people that is. You start thinking in terms of stadiums. Like that's a lot of stadiums full of people. And I didn't, you know, I was delighted with the reception, but it never occurred to me to make it into a game. And then Kotaku wrote an article saying it was ambitious enough to be its own game, and that was very flattering, but I didn't take it very seriously. And then I met a couple of devs here in Melbourne at League of Geeks who said, "Why don't you turn it into a standalone game?" And the reason that I didn't, as I told them at the time, was one, I don't have time. I have a job. Two, I don't have a budget, because making games is really expensive. And three, I have absolutely no idea how to make standalone games. But it's sort of, that conversation planted a seed. And so for the next 12 months, I just ruminated on it again and again, and just trying to figure out how I was going to solve all these problems. And in the end, I solved all of the problems by, one, quitting my job, which is the most insanely risky thing I've ever done in my life. Two, you know, digging into my personal savings. And three, hiring this amazing Unreal Engine programmer who had all the experience that I was missing to join my team so we could make a prototype. Yeah, so ultimately I felt I had to make a choice between continuing in the legal profession and game dev, and people definitely didn't understand. And I knew they wouldn't, which is why I never sort of made it clear to them. I didn't talk to my professional colleagues about what I was doing, because I just kept my world separate. And that became impossible once PC Gamer started running articles about the mod. And I remember one of my senior colleagues calling me over and saying, just pointing at his computer screen, which had, you know, the article about the mod on it. He said, "Is this you?" And I said, "Yeah." When I was back in the legal profession, one senior member of the profession said to me, once he found out that I'd been modding in my spare time, that every waking hour of your life should be spent dedicated to your legal career. And that was his way of saying, you know, drop this game dev nonsense. It's not going to lead anywhere. And yeah, their relationship deteriorated after that. I mean, it felt like jumping out of a plane without a parachute, and all I had was a plan to teach myself how to fly by the time I hit the ground. So yeah, I worked 80 hours a week for the last 4.5 years just to make sure that the project was a success, because the consequences of it failing would have been devastating. When you leave the legal profession for that long, you can't get back in. As a general rule, people just won't employ you because, you know, your skills and experience are no longer useful. And so yeah, this project had to succeed, and so I worked really long hours. And I want to make a point of saying that that's not something that I encourage or condone, and certainly I would never allow my staff to work those kinds of hours. That's not healthy or sustainable. But for me, it was necessary because I was still learning, and I had to make sure that the game was successful, and because I just had so much on the line.
While many of the Forgotten Cities core ideas were established in the mod, the story needed to be rewritten and overhauled for the standalone game. Nick and the team needed to land on a setting that could not only facilitate the themes of the mod, but also give it its own style and personality. It was here that Nick decided to leverage another one of his passions.
So for the game, I changed the setting from fantasy to a sort of more historical setting for a few reasons. The first one is that, you know, I've always been really fascinated with ancient Rome. The novel that I was writing was set in ancient Rome, so I already had a sort of a library about the width of my arm span of reference books on ancient Rome. So that was something that I was really interested in. And it's always been a fantasy of mine to be able to travel back in time to ancient Rome as an outsider and just sort of walk among Romans and witness their, you know, really majestic art and architecture and sort of witness their customs. And I think a lot of other people have that fantasy as well. It's just a really, really interesting period in history. And so that was the first reason. The second reason is that the story of the Forgotten City is about collective punishment. You know, that this is a city where if one person sins, everybody dies. And the idea of collective punishment was really well known to the Romans.
The many shall suffer for the sins of the one.
They had this military practice of decimation, where 1 in 10 soldiers could be executed for the crimes of the collective. And they also had the Roman poet Virgil telling a very famous story about Baucis and Philemon, where the gods wiped a city off the map for failing their bizarre secret morality test. So the story that I was trying to tell fit naturally really well into that framework of history and mythology. And the third reason is something I can't really talk about, but just for spoiler reasons. But I think when you get about halfway through the game, you sort of go, oh, okay, that's why it's set in ancient Rome. I think you probably know what I'm talking about, but changing the setting to a real-world setting allowed me to just go all in with that stuff, and that's something that I find fascinating, and I think it's really struck a chord with a lot of people as well, because you don't see that in games very often. When I decided to make the game setting an ancient Roman city, I realized very quickly that I was going to need some help, because I knew just enough to know how little I knew. And so I reached out to this fellow called Dr. Philip Matijac, who has a doctorate in philosophy from Oxford and teaches at Cambridge. And when I reached out, I thought, oh, there's no way this guy's gonna be interested. It's just an indie game after all. And he's so impressive, and he's written 17 books, and he's very, very learned. But yeah, he was really interested, and it turned out he was an avid gamer, and he clocked about 2,000 hours in Guild Wars and Guild Wars 2. And so for about 20 months, he and I exchanged well over 300 emails. We jumped on countless calls, including video calls where I'd sort of fly around the world showing him what we'd done with it, and he would just give advice as he saw things and sort of make little corrections, and he'd tell us about things like, those pillars are too close together, or there should be 6 pillars instead of 4 there, or technically that's not a temple, it's a shrine, so you're going to have to change that. And one of the things he noticed was, that our carrots were orange instead of purple, and he explained that that they should be purple, and that carrots throughout history had been purple until something like the 17th century. It was a really wonderful, enriching experience, actually. And he's a really funny, hilarious guy. We talked about all sorts of issues from, graffiti to how Romans swore, and to, toilets, and, some pretty earthy topics. Some of that's evident in the game. If you wander into the public toilet, you see an actual historically authentic Roman public toilet complete with cleaning stick, the communal cleaning sticks that are just horrifying from a hygiene perspective. And he also introduced me to a wonderful archaeologist called Dr. Sophie Hay, who has 20 years experience excavating the ruins of Pompeii. Yeah, she helped us out with getting an architecture and art right, and to make sure that all our mosaics and niches and columns and the interior domes of our temples and shrines were sort of historically accurate as well. So yeah, we put a lot of effort into making sure that we're delivering on that implied promise of showing people how it would feel to travel back in time in ancient Rome.
The historical setting also meant that Nick had to rethink how he wrote his characters. One of the more interesting examples of this is Dooley, the poor fellow you find locked up near the markets.
So yeah, I had to think carefully about how that was going to look, because you can't just transpose them directly. You have to change their name, and you have to give them a backstory that actually makes sense in the context of an ancient Roman city in the 1st century AD. And so I did some research into how people with disabilities were treated in ancient Rome, and it's actually kind of horrifying. The 12 tables of the Republic dictated that people with disabilities, or children with severe disabilities, would just have to be killed as soon as they were born. So yeah, obviously it was a much harsher period in history, and so I had to think about how we're going to have that view toward people with disabilities manifest, and was that going to how would that look in this city where everybody's terrified that somebody is going to commit the sin or make a mistake that's going to break the golden rule. And so in the end, it seemed like a natural conclusion to have Dooley essentially locked up at the beginning of the game. So he's essentially been imprisoned because they can't kill him, but they also don't want to let him free because they're concerned that he's a liability. And so it's quite I think a heart-wrenching story to see how this endearing guy with a disability has been treated by these Romans who who have a much harsher perspective on people with disabilities than we do.
Part of that implied promise was also making sure that the standalone game looked and played as good, if not better, than the mod. Using the Unreal Engine as a foundation, Nick and the team needed to build out a world complete with features and technology comparable to the Bethesda Creation Kit, a game engine created by the biggest RPG studio in the world.
I always think of the mod as a rough first draft of what the game became. My mission right from the beginning was to just level up every aspect of the mod that could be leveled up. And so when I decided to reimagine it as a standalone game, we were at a massive disadvantage because all we had was, we started with Unreal Engine, which is an awesome engine, but we didn't have any of the tools or the gameplay mechanics or elements that were required to make a game. And so we had to, from scratch, build all of the sort of underlying tools and systems for the game that the mod was built on. So when you mod, it's a bit like standing on the shoulder of a giant. A lot of the work's done for you. But when you make a standalone game, you've really got to just build everything yourself from the ground up, and that is an immense amount of work. And so it's an absolute credit to our programmer Alex Goss, who did the work of an entire team of programmers over 4.5 years by getting the game to work and work well.
It's easy to see how well the Forgotten City looks and plays now, but one of the largest hurdles the team had to overcome were the facial animations. There's a reason why facial animations are hard to come by in smaller scale 3D games, and it's because it's incredibly difficult. Unfortunately, this wasn't an option for Modern Storyteller. The entire game was designed around conversations. To make things even tougher for the team, they didn't have a budget to hire a dedicated animator.
So if you think about all of the narrative-driven games in the last sort of 5 or 10 years, things like Firewatch and Dear Esther and Ethan Carter and that kind of thing, the one thing they have in common is that they carefully avoid NPC dialogue. And I think it's because it's just breathtakingly difficult. And so most indies don't even attempt it. But we didn't have that luxury because, you know, the mod had good quality, you know, dialogue with characters, and this game is about talking to people. So it was absolutely critical that we had character dialogue. We also didn't have a budget for an animator, which made our predicament even more challenging. We did our best initially, and we released some footage of it, and it did not go well. People really didn't like the earlier character animations and dialogue system, and with good reason. It wasn't great. And so after we got a shellacking from some mainstream media, I reached out to a fellow called Sean Stewart from Obsidian, who very kindly offered some of his time, and he sort of got us on a Zoom call and gave us a huge amount of really valuable information about how to make character dialogue animations. And so with that help, we redesigned an entire sort of modular library of animations and figured out the logic to how to make it all fit together. And I think from a consumer perspective, or even a press perspective, it's very easy to underestimate how difficult this process is. Like, if you think about a dialogue animation system from the ground up, you know, you start with just a static character, and obviously just having someone just stare at your static it looks awful. So then you've got to have lip sync that obviously syncs with the dialogue, and that's one step. But then it's still they're just very robotic, and it still looks really inhuman. So then there's another layer, which is that you have to have them breathing or idling gently, so their sort of shoulders have to gently rise and fall. So they're standing there looking at you, their shoulders are gently rising and fall, but it still looks really robotic and alien because they're not blinking and they don't have any expressions. And so then you have to make sure that their head sort of bobs gently in rhythm with what they're saying. Otherwise, they look far too still. Even if the whole body is moving, people, you know, when they talk to you, their head starts moving a little bit and then sort of falls and becomes a bit more still once they stop talking. And then you've got to think about blinking, and blinking, it's not just a regular rhythm, it changes dynamically depending on, you know, their emotional state. And you've also got to think about facial expressions and emotional state, but the challenge there is that you can't make it, you can't have it override the lip sync, because the lip sync and the emotional state will compete with each other, and then you'll get sort of jankiness. So to have a character dialogue animation system working with all these simultaneous layers and to have it work perfectly and come across like you're talking to a real person is breathtakingly difficult, even with an animator. And we didn't have an animator, so it was really just me and Alex Goss, our programmer, trying to figure out how to do this. And look, I think, you know, the results are pretty good. They're not AAA, but I think given how difficult it is to do, I think it's a miracle that the game's animations look as good as they do, honestly.
Building out an engine and crafting a believable world is only half the battle, though. The game also needed to be fun. And for a game that has you repeat the same day over and over and over again, this can get a little tricky. The team needed to come up with sensible ways for players to skip things they'd already done while making each loop feel meaningful. So Nick and the team had one major question they needed to answer. How does a game like The Forgotten City not feel repetitive?
It was really important to me that looping through time didn't feel repetitive, and that it felt fun. And so I went back and watched one of my favorite movies of all time, Groundhog Day. And one of the ways that they make sure that it's not repetitive when Phil Connors is looping through time is that they cut. So if a scene is redundant, they'll just cut it. And so what you end up with is like a montage of Phil Connors doing the same scene in a bunch of different ways, but it's a bit different every time, and you don't have to worry about watching the lead up to that scene over and over again. But you can't really do that in a video game because, you know, the player has agency and control over where the camera is pointing, and so you can't just jump from one scene to another. It would just be really disorienting. And so the way the technique I came up with to overcome that is quest delegation. So for example, if in the first time loop you manage to save a woman's life, then next time you loop through time, we're not going to make you go and save her life again. We're just going to let you have a simple conversation with this helper NPC Galerius, and he's going to go and run and tell, and and save that woman's life for you. And so in that way, we were able to try to stop the game from feeling unnecessarily repetitive, because you never have to do the same thing more than once for the most part. And then, of course, that sort of mechanic, I made it so that it was sort of immersed into the story of the game as well, or sort of it ties in with the story of the game, and ultimately, the errands that you send him on have story consequences, and they snowball into a meaningful story outcome.
How is it possible that you've just arrived here and you already know everyone and exactly what's about to happen to them?
The other objective was to make it feel fun, and so when I was rewatching Groundhog Day, one of the things that was really clear to me was that this sense of playfulness and fun from the movie comes about because the main character has the freedom to do whatever he wants in a virtually consequence-free environment. And so with a lot of the quests and just activities in the game, I just wanted to try to create that sense of fun, so that when players are experimenting and goofing around, that they can go and do a bunch of stuff that's just going to be entertaining, and also just even in dialogue where a character will start talking to you and you can just cut them off and say, look, we've had this conversation before, you're about to say X, Y, and Z, and they'll kind of freak out because they realize that you have had the conversation before, but how is that possible? It's a lot of fun just sort of seeing their reactions and exploiting the knowledge that you have from previous time loops to for example, swindle con men out of their ill-gotten gains. That's really emotionally satisfying to do. If it had taken itself a lot more seriously, I think it probably would have missed out on some of that fun. And tone is a really interesting thing with The Forgotten City, because on one hand, there are moments of levity and there's this sort of feeling of fun and exploration, and there are jokes, some of which land better than others. But at the same time, some of the other subject matter is really quite dark. There are people killing themselves or essentially finding themselves in what is tantamount to slavery. But I think also the flip side of that is that you get to undo some of that darkness. You have to sort of start dark in order to be able to go lighter. And so finding the right balance of tone was a challenge, but I think it actually worked out remarkably well in terms of how the sort of competing tones work together. And I think that's just because that's what life is like. I mean, there are moments of levity, and there are moments of really dark stuff. And I don't think you have to apologize for including both in a game. I think it's just what life is.
Along with making each loop feel fresh, Nick and the team worked hard to make sure players were given enough freedom while also keeping them relatively on track with the narrative. The Forgotten City is a mystery after all, and it's important for players to chase whichever lead they choose.
We place a lot of trust in the intelligence of players to figure out these things for themselves, and I think that was a sort of key design philosophy, because we are making games for intelligent, thoughtful adults who enjoy figuring things out for themselves. And so spoon feeding them, it's just not what they want, and it doesn't give them that sense of agency or ownership over the ending that they get. And that was really important to us. I want people to get to whatever ending they get to and feel like they deserve that ending because of the decisions they made. And when you get to the canon ending, I wanted that to be the ultimate emotional reward for really thoroughly exploring and investigating and making smart decisions and making smart arguments. It is difficult to make sure that players have, that they experience the best of the story while also being free to roam and do things in whatever order they please. And there are a few techniques that we use to do that. So for the most part, players are free to wander around the city and talk to people in any order, and we have to anticipate that. So there are lots and lots and lots of little conditions that say, look, if you talk to this person without talking to that person first, then you'll get this type of dialogue. And keeping track of that is it's brain-bendingly challenging. But there are certain key beats in the story that you really want players to experience, and so to that end, we do sort of try to gently nudge them in that direction. And one of the ways we do that is in the game, at least. There are these golden statues scattered throughout the world, and one of the mysteries is why these statues occasionally kind of whisper to you as you walk past. And sometimes they'll give you sort of cryptic hints, but in the back end, there's quite a lot of logic that dictates what the whispers to you should be at any given time, and they sort of help guide the player toward where we hope they'll go in a sort of non-intrusive and immersive way. Originally, they were just supposed to be something that was a bit haunting and unsettling, but then it occurred to me as people were testing the game and some people were struggling with it a bit, the statues whispering a bit more as a kind of immersive tutorial device. I personally really dislike it when games just give you a text message telling you what to do. Like sometimes there'll just be this pop-up saying, you know, you should go and do this. I wanted to avoid that at all costs, and so yeah, in the end, I settled on repurposing these existing sort of whispering statues as a way of sort of gently nudging the player in the direction that we wanted. And it ends up having sort of greater plot significance as well. It's sort of woven into the story, and I think that helps it kind of feel, you know, natural and immersive rather than just this sort of tacked on device that we're using. And look, there are certain parts of the game that we just accept that people won't necessarily discover, and I think that's okay, because ultimately, even if you play through the game and miss out on a whole ending or a whole storyline that leads to the best ending, that's actually kind of good, because it means that you've got something to look forward to the next time you play. On the eve of the release, before any of the reviews had come out, I really didn't know what to expect. I thought maybe we'd get, you know, 60s or 70s, and I sort of braced myself to be happy with that, because, you know, it was our first game, and it's a fiercely competitive industry, and who knows what people want, right? Like it's just so incredibly subjective. And so I just sort of took stock of where I was, and I thought, you know, I don't think I'm going to read these reviews, because, you know, I've already done what I set out to do, in the sense that, you know, I've made a game that I'm really proud of, and I had a wonderful time doing it, and you know, it's been an incredible journey, and I've learnt so much, and so, you know, and I probably won't worry about the reviews. And then I got a major reviewer DMing me on Twitter to say, hey, we're giving it a 9 out of 10, just FYI. And then it sort of blew my mind, because I really didn't expect that, and I'd just been bracing myself to just not care about the critical response. And so then at that point, I just went, oh, forget it. I'm going to have to read the reviews now. So so I started reading them, and I was absolutely blown away by the critical response. I think on Metacritic, we've now got a weighted average of 85 on PC and higher on Xbox Series. So I think that, you know, the game's like currently ranked 15th best game of 2021, which it doesn't sound like much. And then you consider that, you know, there are like 10,000 games released on Steam every year. So it's actually pretty good. It's so incredibly gratifying to hear reviewers and users, you know, just having a wonderful time with it. You know, fundamentally, you know, when you're in the entertainment industry, when you sort of look at what's really important, it's just making people happy. And if as an entertainer you're making people happy in whatever way you can, whether it's through encouraging them to be thoughtful and introspective and grapple with some philosophical questions, or just goofing around in a time loop, then that's a wonderful thing. And I think we could all do with a bit more happiness during a global pandemic. So yeah, I'm very happy that it's touching people's lives in that way.